these two people here. I'm going to ask a question to begin the conversation. There's no real certain structure of this discussion, so please ask questions or partake in it, and we'll kind of go from there. Okay. I'm David Shapley. I'm the chair of the art department, and welcome to this panel discussion titled Color in Black Visual Art and Culture. The panel discussion is part of the current exhibit that you see here in the gallery, which is titled Contemporary Directions, Niger to Afrofuturism. Both these events are part of the Westfield State University celebration of Black History Month. And so to my far left here is Professor Zara Caldwell from the Ethics and Gender Studies Department. And to my left here is artist Toby Sisson.
You got it.
Her work is back here. Toby is an associate professor of studio art in the Visual and the Performing Arts Department at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her work has been shown throughout New England and the country and globally. I'm going to introduce Ghislaine, even though she's not here. Her work is back there on the right. She is a New York-based artist. She was raised on the outskirts of Paris, France, and born in the country of Congo. And she has shown her work out through New York City greatly. And I will start by asking a question. So my own work is very much black and white. And so when I read Toby's, some of her topics about her work, I really engaged with that. I'm like, that's really interesting. And what I was gonna start by asking her or asking her to discuss more, or both of them, is that she talks about using, she states that the color black acts as both a presence and absence, and how a spot of darkness influences a field of white, and how opposites, black and white, attract and repels. So I thought it was really interesting just in the terms of the graphic part. And so I'm going to ask her to maybe discuss her work or more about that. I'm going to sit down here for now.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me, first of all. It's really lovely to be here. I'm so happy that I arrived on a day when it is not a blizzard. So I come from Providence. It's a pretty easy 2-hour drive, but it was lovely to come here on a dry day. And again, thank you all for coming and being interested in this exhibition and more generally and in my work specifically. I hope that I can illuminate things for you about why I do what I do, both formally, what it looks like and why it looks the way it does, and conceptually, what the ideas, the meaning, the themes that I'm dealing with in this work. And I do hope that we have a dialogue. I don't want to be the person, just the talking head that's just telling you things. I'm really hoping that you have questions, or if you have concerns, they can be specifically about the work that I do, they could be about art in general, or the work that you make and the questions that you have. As David kindly mentioned, I'm also a professor, so I enjoy engaging with the students, and I'm really interested in your questions and what kinds of things that you're interested in doing. In response to your question about my color palette, I suppose, it's one way to think about it, is I've been what I would consider achromatic, meaning that I don't use the full chroma of all of the color spectrum in most of my work. I have done that some in the past, but I'm doing that less and less. I would say within the last decade, really, very little of my work has not been black and white. And I do occasionally get questions about that. I think people wonder why you would confine yourself in that way. I don't know if that happens with you at all.
Yes.
Or when you select a palette as a student, when you're thinking about what's the color of my work and why is it going to be that color? I ask myself these questions all the time. I'm really interested in making work that it feels as if it's graphic. And I think something about black and white, if you think about ink, black ink on a white page, it has that same sort of graphic quality. It feels as if there's an underlying message. And I also think formally that when you work with black and white, or when you reduce the amount of color that you have in your work, that form takes a higher role in the work. It becomes more about shape, design, and composition, because there's a little less distraction that you get from having other colors. And since I'm trying to communicate very specific ideas that I have, I want to not have it filtered through lots of other information, and color can be lots of other information. So first of all, formally I choose black and white because I think that's the clearest way and direct way to communicate, and I like its relationship to graphic text. And I also think, and this might be something that is particular to me and may not always be picked up on by the viewer, but I'm very interested in the sort of hidden, but maybe it's not always so hidden, way that I'm racializing my work. So I'm thinking about black and white metaphorically in terms of a racialized content of black and white. But I don't think that's the only way to enjoy the work, or the only thing that you could take from the work. It's just one component of it, and it's fairly important for me, but I understand that unless you read about my work or I tell you about it, that may be something that's not perceived by the viewer. So those are just a couple of the reasons why I'm thinking about black and white in the work. And I'm wondering if you have any other questions. I can go on, but teachers love the sound of their own voice.
I love that you reference Hurston. I was just thinking to myself, I know you referenced Hurston for your work, which I thought was really powerful. And I thought immediately about this quote, and I don't know, some of my classes have read this, but not as many, but she has an essay called How It Feels to Be Colored Me. And she talks about, it's Hurston, so she's kind of, Zero No Hurston. She's a writer she's kind of from the Harlem Renaissance, but probably a little bit askew sometimes. But anyway, she has an essay, and she describes people coming to her like she's a problem, like that's how they approach her. Oh, you're a black writer. How is that? Oh, you're a black woman who's working on these things, and the treatment of her by society is these questions as if she's a problem as opposed to just being a human. And she has this line, you probably know this line I'm talking about, where she says that she, at times she feels like a black spot on a white, like a very stark white background, which is like this kind of really beautiful statement. And I thought immediately about that black spot, in multiple ways. So this idea about her being a singular figure in this kind of like very advanced literary world that she's existing in. She's probably doing things in literature that we still haven't matched. And then she's also kind of seeing herself, because the article isn't about her pity for herself. Her article is about how great she is and how she feels sorry for people that they can't, basically bask in her glow. So it's also that piece too. It's like it's a bad thing in some ways for her to be this black spot, but then there's beauty in it because she knows the beauty of this kind of like stark contrast. That unfortunately for that very stark white, they're missing it. So I thought about that, and I thought about that idea about black as presence and absence, and I just wanted to add. I'm just going to say this one thing that I think as we're like listening, you guys are very serious, which is great and funny, but that black artists. So you're here sitting on Black Arcade. My teacher made me come, but let's be like very clear that a black artist is like seeing a multicolored butterfly that comes once a year, because you have to invest and you have to be driven and you have to have this thing in you that you can't avoid doing this work, because there's so many other things that you could be doing with your time. You're still behind economically and socially in other ways. I know people who told their parents they're going to be artists and the parents like burst out in tears. I mean, literally, like, how are you going to support yourself? Are you crazy? You want to be a black artist? Like, artists are already broke. Think about black artists. Are you, like, is everything going okay with you? I didn't put you through school to do art. That's crazy. So make sure that you're thinking about just how amazing it is for people to, like, kind of dedicate themselves to anything extra in their day, just be around creative. So that means that they're pushed. There's something internally that's making them create. Anyway, that's what I was thinking about for the very stark white, black and white contrast.
Well, if you'd like, I can speak a little bit to some of my inspirations. Hurston is certainly a wonderful writer and someone that I'm drawn to. But one of the things that inspired the work that you see directly behind me is another African-American writer, and that is James Baldwin. And so, I'm specifically thinking about, when I was making this work, his poetry. And he's not as well known for his poetry. If you're aware of Baldwin, you may know him because he's most famous as a novelist and as a social activist and as a public intellectual. Baldwin, I guess you would say his rise or his heyday was in mid-century America. And he passed away in 1987. And my first interaction with Baldwin was because he was my mother's favorite writer. And so, I don't know if you're like me at all, but sometimes what your parents are really interested in is not necessarily the thing that you're interested in as a child. But I have found that I've circled back and I've revisited those things that were really interesting to my parents. And James Baldwin's writing is one of those things. A few years ago, there was a release of some of his lesser-known poems. And he'd published a volume called Jimmy's Blues and Other Poems. And then they were re-released just a few years ago. This compilation, this collection of verses that many people had never seen before. So I picked up a copy. It's a slim paperback volume. I picked up a copy and I started reading them in my studio. I always have lots of things that I can source and be interested in alongside my painting and drawing and printmaking practice. So I'm reading Baldwin's poems from decades ago, and I was struck by how current they felt. And think back a couple of summers ago when Trayvon Martin was killed, when Michael Brown was killed, when it started to bubble up into the news, this rise in public attention for violence against African Americans, particularly black men. So that's happening on NPR in the background, on the radio in my studio, and I'm reading James Baldwin's poems about violence to black bodies in mid-century America. And I was really, really struck by how, in some ways, the problems that Baldwin was talking about were the same problems that we were facing today. And I felt this enormous sense of grief, in part because of that sense of how little had changed and that these tragedies were ongoing. But I was also so struck by how beautifully he was able to speak to these things with his words. I like to write, but I'm no Baldwin. But what I do like to do is draw and paint and print in response to what's going on in the world around me. Those of you who are art students may feel that way as well. That this becomes a cathartic way, a release for you to express what you're feeling about what's going on in your own life and what you're seeing happening in the public. So I decided that I wanted to do a work of some kind, I wasn't sure what yet, that was in direct response to Baldwin's poems and also what I was hearing in the news and seeing in terms of demonstrations on the streets, things that I was a part of myself as well. And one of the things that started happening in my studio was something that I would say is akin to like automatic writing. I don't know if any of you keep a journal. One of the things that I do is have sort of a daily practice of doing some kind of small drawing. And they're very modest. They're not necessarily on special paper or with any beautiful art supplies, but often it's just with a pencil in my sketchbook. But in this particular point, I was working with ink drawings. So I would have these really inexpensive sumi brushes and sumi ink. And I did have a little stash of paper that I had made. So there was some handmade watercolor paper. And I started making forms on my paper in response to the news and into Baldwin's poems. And they had sort of like automatic writing, no predetermined form. It was just going to spill out of me. And I noticed that as I was making these designs or shapes on paper, that they had the shape of a tear, or they were oval, kind of like dark moons. I don't have that work here. It's a very large installation, at least it eventually became that. But I started making something that I eventually called Black Tears. And they were just very simple black ink and water drawings on paper that felt as if they were a response to the grief that I was feeling internally, and was a way for me to mourn privately. And I also realized that this outpouring of grief in some way was similar to what I was seeing in people protesting on the streets, a sort of public outpouring of grief. Well, I kept making them, and I kept making them, and I kept making them, and a handful turned into dozens, turned into hundreds, and I eventually had an exhibition about a year later, and I covered an entire wall with black tears, these watery, fluid, pooling drips that I had made so quickly and so sort of nonchalantly, just in response to what was happening around me. So I say all of that to tell you that sometimes the work comes out of a place that you're not even fully aware of, and kind of like poetry, where it's a very personal response to what's going on in the world. You may not know what the eventual product will be, or its eventual life in the world, what place it will have in the world, but you may feel compelled to make things in that way. So I am thinking about historical resources. I am thinking about Zora Neale Hurston, and very often I've become more and more immersed in the work of James Baldwin, someone I would all recommend that you look up. Google James Baldwin, you'll see wonderful things. If you can go to your library, I'm sure they'll have some volumes, if not of his poetry, certainly of his novels, which I would highly recommend. So that's sort of the source point of where some of this work comes out of. The ink drawing that's in the center is called Jimmy's Blues number 14. Because I also started making, in addition to the tears on the side, I started making these washes with ink. And for those of you who maybe on this side of the room can get a little side view of a couple of ink drawings that I've done that are mounted on board. So they're basically ink on paper, similar to what I did with the Black Tears project, but then these are mounted on board, and then they're covered with a surface of beeswax. And beeswax is wonderful because it protects the surface. So unlike paper that's vulnerable, this gives me a way to protect that surface as opposed to having them framed and under glass.
And there's texture there.
Yeah.
Did I lay Hurston on you? I thought I read Hurston.
No, that's okay. It's an influence as well.
Yeah. I did see Baldwin. How you doing, Hurston?
Oh, and our other artist is here.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
How are you? Please, David Shepherd.
Ghislaine.
That's what I
Thank
thought
you.
about when I was
This is
Hi, I'm Toby.
I'm Ghislaine.
Hi, I'm Zara.
I'm Ghislaine. It's amazing.
And here are students.
Oh.
Ghislaine is from the department.
Okay.
So we just began a discussion. Thank you for coming. We'll just kind of
Oh, great.
keep going here. This is Ghislaine
Ghislaine Sabiti.
Sabiti, right? That was the artist over that way there. I guess I'll kind of backtrack a little bit just to kind of get her into the conversation here. I started off by asking Toby a question, or asking her to respond to something that she discusses about both the. She states the color black, which I thought was interesting. We were talking in the hallway about, is black a color, and about how it has a presence and an absence in her work, and how a little darkness can influence a field of white. So this is how this discussion started about it that way there. She was talking about her work, referencing her sources. So I don't know if Zara, were you about to say something, and you can go ahead?
Oh,
or?
no, I don't. We don't.
Hate to kind of throw you
I
in the spotlight.
No, I was
Please
going to
do.
say, because you have this introduction
Yep.
for Toby's work, and I was going to say, Ghislaine, is it Sabati or
Sabiti.
Sabiti? I like your mention of social change through identity. That was really great, and I thought that I'm just going to put this
Please.
into. I thought that your kind of connection. I wrote down notes for each of you guys, which. Not to compare you guys to people, but I thought about Haradina Pindell and this kind of honoring of ancestry I thought I saw in your work, and
Yes.
how I think your work is so important because it grounds us, in the continent, and there's a diasporic connection that, I think connects all the works. We have Puerto Rican, it's kind of cool.
Yes.
So I kind of saw yours as kind of like a foundation, and then and I'm not an art historian, I'm a cultural historian, so we're not gonna. So anyway, I appreciated like all the texture, and for me, I immediately thought about, like Africa. I thought about, for me, as African American, I thought about slavery. I thought about a lot of like references that were really grounded in, Africa. So that's what I got from your stuff, and I did love the social change to identity, which I think is what we're working on daily as Black people, because that's the other piece that we didn't mention, is that Black is an identity that we share, and then we have different ethnicities within that, which I think people sometimes don't understand. Like, so how can you be Black, Afro-Caribbean, and also Black American, and also, because Black is a shared identity, but we have different ethnicities within that.
And you have quite a few.
Yes, I live in 3 different continents. I was born in Congo in Africa, grew up in Paris, and I was raised in Paris, and I moved here 7 years ago. So that's why my work is also cultural, and I try to build bridges between community because I'm from 3 different continents. So I like mixing the Western culture and also the African culture together, because this is what it is now in this day. Everything is mixed. You are also, everybody's come from mixed culture, mixed identity. So I feel like this is very important for me to show that in my paintings.
I was talking to my class here earlier, and going back to the use of white or use of black. I really enjoyed your larger painting there with the white background, and the black marks on the white background. Really, again, my work is also in black and white. Really kind of engaged me in that use of line and that kind of duality between the starkness we were talking about and the kind of marking that Toby was talking about. Toby, you also discuss about outreach that you do too in your work in general, or right, similar to.
Yeah, I mean, I do some public projects too. One of the things I really like, and this maybe goes back to what you were saying earlier about parents' fear of students majoring in art, and because I confront that a lot too in my own classroom, and people have a certain fear about, well, if I pursue the arts, how am I going to make a life? Essentially. And I think one of the important things to remember is that although there is the stereotype of the artist who's toiling away and starving in a garret, there's lots and lots of different ways to engage with art in the world. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is having various streams, various different ways to engage the work. So I have my own solo studio practice, but one of the things that I really enjoy is doing public art projects. That's where, as you mentioned, working across community, bridging difference, bringing different communities in contact that might not otherwise intersect, and having dialogues and discussions about the nature of making, about the nature of the content of the work, how to make work, and how the work lives in the world. So yeah, I've done a number of public projects. As a matter of fact, just recently, I guess it's been about 2 weeks ago, I did an extension of the Black Tears Project, which I just described, and I did it on my campus at Clark University. We had a racial justice teach-in to commemorate Black History Month, and specifically, it was right after Martin Luther King Day. And not coincidentally, it also happened to be on Inauguration Day. So on January 20th, we had a racial justice teach-in, and there were various, maybe you do something similar here at Westfield, but we had various different topics that were addressed by faculty and staff and administration, and also some forums that were put on by students where they had panel talks and discussions and different events that the students organized, and they happened all day long across campus on Friday the 20th. And they weren't necessarily in protest or even in resistance to the inauguration, but there was part of that I think was seated in there for many students, and others that just wanted to take up the ideas of public discourse. So the panel that I was working with actually decided to turn into a bit of a workshop. And so I brought in lots and lots and lots of those brushes I talked about, and watercolor paper, and lots of ink. And we all made black tears together. So I introduced the project, but I in no way wanted to confine students to simply implementing my vision. I wanted people to be able to make whatever types of marks they were interested in making, knowing that they would be put on exhibition and display within the university for the campus community. So I've done things like that on campus, and I've also done some public engagement with mural projects and things like that throughout the greater Worcester area. And at a previous academic appointment, when I was in graduate school as well, I come from the Midwest, I was at the University of Minnesota, and I did a number of community projects with immigrant populations around campus, a largely East African population of Kenyans and Somalians in that community, in that city.
There's a question way back there. 2 questions.
Yeah, so I'm an anthropologist here, and I teach in ethnic and gender studies at Sarah. And one of the things we talk about with our students a lot is intersectionality. Like you guys are saying, sort of, it's not just, you see the work as a sort of a cultural statement or a personal statement, a statement about race, class, or gender, or any of these things. These are readings we put on these works. But I'm really interested in culture shock in art, and looking at how people are crossing cultures in their art and mixing culture in their art. It's just so interesting to me as an anthropologist. And it just really struck me, the piece you said was a James Baldwin piece that's layered, the piece behind you. It struck me so hard that some of the Georgia O'Keeffe work that I've been studying, where she was using monochrome, she had stopped using color. And it had to do with getting out of the East Coast and how people had stereotyped her as a woman, because also Stieglitz had been using her portrait and her body to talk about women's bodies and to talk about sort of this artsy, but also typical sort of male gaze in photography at the time. And it really struck me that it just reminded me so much of that moment where she breaks out and goes west and leaves the east behind. And she said that she didn't know, she had been looking for a teacher to teach her how to do a landscape, and she realized that she was going to have to teach herself. And so she starts with black and white. And it always struck me so heavily that these personal decisions, it's like getting very minimal. When these culture shock moments happen in a biography of a person, things get really elemental and powerful. I'm very struck by that, and I find that also incredibly powerful. And I didn't know if you guys wanted to talk about the intersectionality of it, sort of as women artists and black artists.
So for me, when I'm looking also through my painting and drawing, is to canalize energy as a human being, and also energy is a main focus on my painting. I feel like with the color guide me to build any subject as a design, as I'm looking through the society. So I feel this is something very important for me, to try to put this energy and make a story. I'm looking to just talk about any subject in our society, or people that never talk about, or usually they put it on the side of. And like right now, I'm working on the invisible people. So it's always the mix of the light, the color, the shadow. And this is very important for me to put it in the front of my painting and as a subject.
Thank you for a question about intersectionality. I think about that as well. I don't think any of us just hold one identity. There are times when parts of your character, your personality, your heritage, however you're self-identifying, maybe come to the fore in a given situation, but obviously we're more complicated than that. We all are. were many things. So I'm also making my work from the perspective or the position of being a female. I'm making my work because I self-identify as African American, or when I was growing up, it was simply Black. But I've also become aware, I would say within the last few years, probably most acutely within the last 5 years, of this space that's now identified as biracial or multiracial, which wasn't really something that we talked about when I was young. When I was your age, that was not part of the conversation. There wasn't, there were terms for it, but actually they were fairly derisive. There were things like mulatto, which nobody wanted to be identified as, and I don't imagine anyone does now. But now there's a great deal of pride centered around being biracial or multicultural. Which simply didn't exist when I was your age. So it's one more identity that I'm sort of folding in and is part of that intersectionality piece. I think another thing that's come to my consciousness rather recently, and this again goes back to the Baldwin poems and my research into Baldwin's life, is he was a gay Black man at a time, mid-century America, when this was simply not something that one talked about openly. There wasn't the acceptance for homosexuality then. Even with the resistance we have now, there was even more resistance then. And as a member of the civil rights movement and as a social activist, I think he felt a great deal of pressure to sort of keep that personal part of his identity hidden. And so this is where what I think I was most interested in with his poetry is it really took hold in his poems. It was as if his personal narrative in his life and his love blossomed in his poetry in a way that it didn't necessarily in the other kinds of work that he did. So I'm always interested in intersectionality. I'm glad you brought that up, and I think that that's becoming increasingly an important part of the conversation around all of the struggles that we're engaged in.
Back there.
Toby?
Yes.
Yes, Toby. I don't want to veer off. It's regarding your paintings in the back. I had a question about, you were saying that you were metaphorically making the art in the black and white fashion. I was wondering if the gray areas had any type of significance within that metaphor in any type of way.
Yeah, for me, I think when I just spoke about this sense of suddenly having a biracial identity, which I didn't assume or feel attached to until rather recently, I think the gray actually speaks to that. It's the actual mixing of black and white.
Right.
And it's funny because if someone were to ask me how do you identify, I think I'm most likely to check the box that says African American, even though now you'll see in forms that there are opportunities for you to say other or combinations thereof of all the other different categories. I think because I spent most of my life, I'm 60 years old, and so most of my life was as African American or a Black woman, it's a little awkward sometimes for me to make that transitional space into being multiracial or biracial, even though I understand that that's how I would be perceived by many. I think one of the ways that there's an outlet for my own personal identity and personal expression in my work is the gray area. I also think about the gray area metaphorically, not just in racialized terms, although that's a big part of it. I think of the gray area literally as we talk about as a euphemism, the gray area.
It's so expanded, that's why, and I, like, when I came here a couple weeks ago and first looked at it, that's what I was kind of getting a sense of as well, because you have like these dark spots, and they're naturally just surrounded by, like, some of them are very gray areas, and it kind of speaks volumes on their fashion of like, what, there is no, I mean, there's black and white, but the gray area itself takes up so much more to talk about. There's so many categories that could fall in, and so many, things that you could jump off that topic.
I think so too. I completely agree with you. I mean, I grew up in a household with a Black father and a white mother, so I was always seeing things in terms of that binary. And of course now that's much more common than it was in my youth, but that was part and parcel, I think, that went into my psyche without even really thinking about it consciously until I was an adult. you know. So now I think I am the little gray area.
It's not necessarily, what we fail to understand is that in between is not necessarily a sliver. It can be bigger than the black and white sometimes.
Yeah.
So I definitely admire that.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it speaks back to that idea of intersectionality.
Absolutely.
Maggie?
I had a question about, I was interested in repetition in your work and kind of the implementation of kind of collecting these individual either compositions or like you were talking about with the tiers, kind of the individual maybe in relation to the collective. I think that's a really sort of important aspect of your work and practice, it sounds like. So I'm sort of interested in that, and then also in relation to this kind of idea of the black spot, both in kind of reference to Hurston, and what you were talking about a little, kind of all over, but we were talking about a little bit with Baldwin too, just, you know, him being gay too as part of that kind of black spot as well within his own context. So I don't know if you could sort of speak at all to kind of maybe that idea of the singular with relation to the accumulation and to the collection. You know, I'm seeing this work, but kind of trying to imagine this other body of work that you've talked about too, which sounds, I imagine, is all kind of the same format. And so the grid is really structurally kind of formally holding it together. And so individually, you're kind of, you know, it feels like it goes through a history because literally it does. You go every day. You're kind of creating an actual documentation of time passing. But then it becomes what I imagine is a kind of like collective kind of historical image of pain. But it also brings a kind of like a transcendence. Like I feel like in that process of you doing that, in seeing the individuals within a collection, I imagine a kind of transition or transcendence and power. So I don't know if you can respond
Well, that
to
was
any of
beautiful, and I wish I had a recording of what you just said. That's like yeah, we use that. That's
They're
lovely.
recording.
Oh, they are? Okay, great. So I'll get to revisit. I'll get to revisit that and sort of ruminate on your words, which sounded so wonderful. You know, I think within this work that the black tears and even these dark moons, which are these circular pieces that you see behind me, the idea of repetition is very important. The idea of elegy is important. And within an elegy, there is pain, but there's also celebration for a life. So again, I'm back to binaries and dualities and thinking about how things are reflected off of one another. I do think that the repetition is very important for me in my work. I always tell my students who have this great idea and sometimes are feeling really frustrated about being able to express it in a painting or a drawing, that it's too much to expect a singular piece to carry your entire message. It's just too great a weight for any individual song, dance, painting, what have you, to carry all it is that you mean to say. So it's probably going to take an entire body of work. And one of the ways that I found to get that sort of echo or to get that impact that one work cannot possibly carry, particularly because I work in a reductive way and fairly simple in terms of the forms, and I'm not working figuratively, so you can't identify a person. Oh, that's a James Baldwin's face. I feel like using repetition simply by repeating something over and over again, it has that greater impact, the effect of an echo or the effect of ripples that are moving out from one singular source. So there's the increase in impact simply by making repetition. I also stay interested in sometimes very simple ideas for a prolonged period. I don't know if that means that you know, I should be thinking about things that are more complex, but I don't know about all of you. Sometimes something that's really simple and singular can kind of hold my attention, but I feel the need to revisit it again and again. So it becomes part of a series, and that's kind of the way I work. I'd be interested in knowing how you think about repeated imagery, or if there's things that come up again and again for you in your paintings.
Yeah, sometimes for me it's more than the texture and the color, because I combine both, and sometimes like after like 10 years I still have the same color or the texture. I add a little bit more, But I feel like this is a story I try to tell, and as you said earlier, one painting and one drawing cannot contain all the message. So it's just a matter of time. You keep telling your story through the painting and drawing, and you just try to grow. And I feel like as an artist, it's also your identity through this body of works. You try to tell the story. So it's not a mistake to have the repetition. It's also who you are inside, and you just show it through your work. But you learn and grow as an artist. So it's just adding more for me. I love combining different textile, like sewing, drawing together, mixed media. So.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
You both discussed that mixed media use in your work, another connection, I guess we have. When I looked at those tiers, we keep talking about these tiers and then they're not here. But one thing I did notice with you is that with those work, you do look at each one and you do respond to each one. You are very much aware of you're not saying simplistically, but you're actually probably doing more work with just responding to what has happened and starting anew. You're very aware of your strokes. I like that, I do not like that, I like how that happened. You try to, and you directly respond to what has happened down the road in the past there. So.
Yeah, for anybody who wants to see that work, it's pretty easy. Just go to tobysisson.com. It's right there. So I apologize that it's not included and we're spending so much time, or I'm spending so much time talking about something that's not in front of you. But I do see all of this work is linked, even though it comes out in different forms. It's all really, it's kind of the same thing in my own head, I guess. And I do work across media as well. I think of these, for instance, the piece in the center, I know sometimes people call it painting because it's a wet media, but because I'm working with ink and a brush, I'm still thinking about it as a drawing. The other pieces on the side, the circular forms, are actually encaustic monoprints. So they're prints. I'm working with pigmented beeswax, and I'm making a print not on a press. So the image is not transferred to the paper with pressure, but it's actually transferred to the paper with heat. So encaustic is a material that's pigmented wax, comes in a solid block as opposed to squeezed out of a tube like an oil paint. And so it's activated with heat. So you get this material in a kind of molten state when it's activated on a hot palette. And then an impression can be made on paper just because the heat transfers the image without really much in the way of pressure. For anybody who does printmaking, just a baren is the way that you would transfer the image.
So I was really taken by a quote you had, Toby, in your website. The artistic image is not intended to represent the thing itself, but rather the reality of the force the thing contains. And that's so true. I think so many times we have students or people who are not really familiar with the arts in a very big way, and they see things that tend to be non-objective, and they just don't understand it. They just don't get it. And I thought that was put so succinctly in this quote. It brought
Well, I stole it from Baldwin, that's why. Not my words, yeah.
It's so true.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you do non-objective abstraction, really any form of abstraction, in some ways I think there's a barrier for the viewer who's not part of the arts community, because they do, just as you say, wonder, what am I to make of this image if I can't read it, if I can't identify or name things? But we all feel differently about another art form like music. That's all abstract. You don't have to be able to play or read music in order to be able to understand the feeling or the emotional content of a melody. And I think similarly about abstract painting and drawing and printmaking is that if the image has been sufficiently worked, which doesn't mean it's the first thing that you make, but sufficiently worked, like crafting a sentence or anything else that you've spent time polishing, it should have a certain impact. And then that impact can be felt by the viewer. How it's translated, of course, that's always changes. But hopefully some of the power that you put into the work will be read. At least that's my
Well, yeah.
aspiration.
My feeling is that it has an energy about it. I mean, not all works do, but a lot of works do, especially everything in this room. And the energy is all in different directions. But it's honest energy. And I think that even the untrained eye notices this.
Do the students have questions? We're like having this art conversation up here. But I think what's important, and I do want to interject that what's important about Black art, and it's like I'm not an art historian, but I know it's the age-old debate about art for art's sake versus not art for art's sake versus why Black folks are doing art like in the 60s or in the 70s or even today. So even something that seems as abstract as Toby's art she has like this very succinct meaning behind it. It's connected to Black bodies. So I want to make sure that we, because we don't want to have a conversation that avoids the depth of the work by focusing just on the form. I think they're both important. So we want to make sure we think about why do we even have Black artists in this gallery during this? I'm a Black historian and I don't believe in Black History Month because I feel like it's like 1 month. I don't have time to go through it. But so I just wanted to make sure that we come back to all the artists here have like these very moving works. I mean, I love this dude. I just love that. I love Ghislaine's work. It's moving. I mean, everything, the collection. Hopefully, you guys, as you're surrounded by it. This brother's interjecting Black bodies into spaces. Hopefully you notice that in places that really, they don't belong. Like this idea that Black is being interjected. In my dissertation I did, Elizabeth Catlett was one of my, I guess that's why I asked her to do this, she was one of my subjects, and I was able to do like one of her last interviews for my dissertation before she died, and she's amazing. She's hilarious. She's hilarious. Just very down to earth and just, like this idea, like I was saying to you guys about being a Black artist, but still like, having to raise her children and still having to work like 4 jobs and just like, having to leave the country because she was being like hunted by McCarthy and those kind of things. But she was kind of going through dementia when I interviewed her, which was kind of a bad thing, but then also turned out to be this kind of good thing because she was very repetitive in the interview. So she would tell me a story and then come back and tell the story again, but she would add details to the story. So it's kind of an interviewer's dream to go back and say, well, can you add to this or whatever? And I'll tell you one thing, the thing that she said consistently was that she made Black art for Black women because somebody had to do it. And she was very like emphatic about that, which I thought was so, and look her up because she's amazing. She's a printmaker, she's a sculptor, she's a painter. Anyway, so she also said that she made museum quality artwork for Black folks because she felt like they deserved to be in that space. So what's funny is you guys are in here and you're very solemn because it's an art talk, and her approach would be that like we all belong in these artistic gallery spaces, and because of the history of these spaces, we have a particular approach. Can I say something else? I'm just gonna.
You go for it.
Something else I was going to share with you guys. So this is a great example. Catlett was a professor in Louisiana. I think she was at Dillard at this point, and she look her up. You promise? Elizabeth Catlett, amazing. She'll change your life. So what she did is that they had segregated spaces, and this is the way that systematic racism works, even in the arts historically, especially in the arts. Most of the museums and the galleries, okay, all of them in Louisiana were in a segregated part of Louisiana, so Black folks could not go into those areas. So they had one of the major museums in New Orleans is in this beautiful park, which is a segregated park. So the museum technically wasn't segregated, but the park was segregated. So it's like another way to have segregated spaces, right? So what she did, which is hilarious and very much her, they had a Picasso exhibit, and this is probably she left the country like 1950, probably 1940 something. So kind of like right near Picasso creating stuff. So she brings her class to the museum on a day that is closed, and she brings the bus to the steps of the museum. So like they get out of the bus, she's funny, right? They get out of the bus and they go into the museum. They never touch the ground of the park. And they go straight up the steps. And they're able to do like the whole museum visit. And these are college students who, some of them were seniors, some of them were art majors. They had never been in a museum. They had never been in a gallery because all the spaces were segregated spaces. So it's not a small thing, like to have Black artists again and to have spaces where Black art can be hung and where Black art can be taken seriously. You guys can go to Yale. Yale has actually a good Black art collection, and it's free. But you go to most of these museums and finding a Black artist will be like finding finding some money on the floor. Like probably not. So it's just something to kind of think about. There's lots of Black artists. And they're also, like we were saying, they're also just people, and they're also just women, and sometimes they're tired, and sometimes they're queer, and whatever. And they just happen to be Black, probably not. Somebody Black had sex with somebody and they had a Black person, so they're not happen to be Black, but they're Black by whatever reason, and it becomes a primary identity often just because of the forces, not because they're excited about, oh, I'm Black and I want to, whatever. Okay? That's all I'm going to say. But you guys should ask questions. Any questions? After all that, nobody has a question? Yes.
You mentioned that you were working on the invisible. What does that mean?
Yeah, my new body of work, I've been working on that for 2 years now, is invisible moduli. So modulis mean obscurity in Lingala. So I try to put the light on the shadow of the people who the society never talk about. So it's the translation between the Lingala is a Congolese language to the English is mean invisible people. So I've been traveling through Europe and here also in America to build a story and look and listen to any people, any individual. And I'm collecting all this information and try to walk and make a story through this, a different story. So I went to UK, Paris. I went to see also some refugee camp in France, as you see, like the refugee situation. So it's very interesting. And also here, living in the city, New York City, there is a lot of invisible people. Nobody talk about them. It could be anybody. Everybody in these days become invisible. You don't have to be homeless. So this is what I'm doing now, and it's very interesting because I'm still working also with mixed media. So it's a combination of textile. I do a lot of embroidery, sewing, and painting. So this is what I'm doing for this past 2 years. And I did also a residency through that. So hopefully we will see the show soon.
You do costume design as well, right?
Yeah. So I studied fine art. I was 12. I went to the fine art school in France. And I have a bachelor degree in fashion design in Paris also. So I always combine fashion, design, and fine art. That's why you see on my painting, I have fabrics and I use my sewing machine. Some of my painting, I just sew it. Wow. I hand stitch, I do embroidery. So I feel like also when you look to our society, everybody is a mix of many things regarding the culture, regarding racial. So that's why in my painting is a mix because it's where I come from. I'm from 3 different countries. And this is why I try to translate on my works.
Anything else? As Zara said, you guys can talk. It's not a formal, stale thing here.
They're scared if they ask a question not to stay longer.
Well, I have a
But they can
question
always leave.
actually. I'm interested in what you all do. You know, are you interested in making work that's bound up with your identity? Are you interested in making work that feels overtly political to you? Are you interested in making work that might be more decorative and less content laden? You know, what kinds of things do you feel? Because essentially, I feel that anyone who's making work in your generation, you know, you're responsible for shaping culture. I'm 60, so my voice is going to be less and less. Your voice is going to become louder and stronger. I'm really interested in what kinds of things you think are important in terms of visual imagery and visual culture.
I've been really inspired by women's rights recently with everything going on politically. I like to consider myself a painter, and just something that I've just recently been so inspired by is women coming together with the marches that are going on, and I've kind of, in a matter of days really, I had like 6 or 7 pieces just kind of pour out of me. I haven't like started working on them yet. They're just like little thumbnail ideas and stuff, but it's all about women empowerment and all different types of women coming together and protecting each other, standing up for each other, just like what women are doing right now together to change the world for each other.
It's a pretty exciting time, isn't it? There's that old saying, may you live in interesting times. That's a two-edged blade. It's also a difficult time that we find ourselves in. It's a frightening time, I think, for many people where we find ourselves, but I also think it's an enormously creative time for people. There's so much going on in the world, and we're so much more connected now than we ever have been in previous generations. What else are you guys interested in doing? You didn't know you were going to be at a panel talk today, did you? Peppered with questions.
I'm not an artist or anything, but I like to write. But I just feel like the least that everybody can do is just give like the information they have in the best way that they know how to like channel that information to learn, like to make other people learn and to learn from other people's like experiences and life paths, because I feel like, speaking personally, like I can't relate to being Black, but I can totally relate to people telling me like stories and telling me what they've been through, so I can have some type of glimpse and have some type of like hindsight of how they are. And same thing for being like Muslim, for being queer, for being any type of minority. Like it's all about like just channeling what you know into like teaching others.
And writing is such an enormously creative act.
Yeah.
So you are a creator.
Well, yeah, I've been having a little bit of writer's block recently.
Okay.
Anybody else? No? Oh.
I have a question. I don't know, I haven't seen any of your previous work, but I noticed that the scale is on the smaller side. Did you have was that intentional? Does that speak volumes for what you're trying to convey? Because just looking around the room, a lot of the work is on a much larger scale. And I think sometimes that can kind of push a message at people. So I'm curious what inspired you to work on a smaller.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thank you. It is smaller, especially compared to what's in this room now. It's one of the reasons I work in multiples, or that question about repetition was important to me, because I can build up scale just with lots and lots of small components. So I'm thinking in terms of units that can be displayed or exhibited. For instance, the dark moons. I have lots and lots and lots of them. Not all of them are framed, but I have many, so that they can actually take up a greater volume of space when they're all exhibited together, similar to the Black Tears, which I'm working on making over 1,000 of them now. I've employed a studio assistant for that, which was really wonderful because it's a student. So I got some grant funding to pay a student. So there are some small ways you can make a little money making art. But yeah, I think one of the reasons why this particular project that grew out of my engagement with Baldwin's work is on the smaller and more intimate scale is simply because I was working from a small text and I was thinking in terms of it having some relationship, some scale relationship to the printed page. So they don't necessarily go much beyond a book size, although in multiples they become larger. In the past I have worked on much larger pieces, but I think I've been more drawn to intimate work that requires you to pull in a little bit to see detail, as opposed to massive. But I think that comes more from my own personal sensibilities. How do you feel about scale?
For me, the scales depend of also the subject I'm working on it. So I work on different scale. It could be small if I want to just to zoom and just tell just a story or draw like a detail. It could be small, like the small scale I use is 10 by 12 and the biggest is like 12 feet. So it depends of what I'm trying to tell, what story and the subject also. So I'm very open using any kind of scale. As I said at the beginning, I love working on mixed media, so it depends also what kind of media I'm using. If it's on paper, I use fabric, I use canvas, so it's all depend.
There's also a practical consideration too I thought of, is sometimes it depends upon the space that you have available to work. So my work tends to expand when I have more space and it contracts when I have less. Right now I'm in a live-work studio and I'm a bit more constrained in terms of storage and actual surface space to work on. And so my work has become smaller and I think, it's definitely, that's an influence, because I simply don't have the space right now. But I look forward to it, going back and forth as I go on.
I guess we'll wrap it up then. Yes. Well, thank you for coming, and thank them for coming, and
Thank you.